this is a brief reading, I would say rereading, of an essay by Jahan Ramazani, which is titled Contemporary Postcolonial Poetry. Now, this essay is quite a relevant one, especially today in the 21st century, when we try to read post-colonial poetry from the former colonized nations, or from nations, or from the context of nations which were once upon a time colonizers. I guess this particular essay tries to interrogate the current context of post-colonial poetry, the current situation of post-colonial poetry all across the globe. And Ramazani's one of those articles which I remember reading was titled "Can Poetry Console a Grieving Public?", wherein he says it's quite difficult to write communal poetry which tries to console a community after a loss, because of the impersonal element which always creeps in. And I guess Ramazani's, many of the writings of Ramazani basically deals with the nuances of poetry, looks into the social function, and also at the same time into the metrical patterns which are followed in poetry in the contemporary situations. And this particular essay too looks at how poetry is being written by post-colonial writers, and how they try, and how these poems actually try to voice the contemporary situation centuries after the colonizers left the land, maybe, or years after colonizers have left, and how post-colonial poetry is still trying to fight a way through the global European standards to get itself visible in the public. Now, he says post-colonial poets have expanded the contours of English language, though they are seldom appreciated, and they have done it with the help of indigenous metaphors, rhythms, creoles, figures of speech, etc., which they have coined from their own regions, from their own experiences, and by adding them to the universal narratives. And he quotes the examples of poets like A.K. Ramanujan, Jamaican poet Louis Bene, Ugandan poet Okotbi Bitek, then Walsoinga, Derek Walcott, Lorna Goodson, who all play with words, with images, how they try to infuse regionalism into European nuances, etc. So these are different ways in which post-colonial poets have enriched the English language. But even then, Ramazani says post-colonial poetry is less visible than other genres like drama or fiction, and he cites two reasons for the same. First, he quotes Eliot, who said that when you take art, there is nothing more stubbornly national than poetry. And he says maybe this is one of those reasons why post-colonial poetry refuses to, or readings of post-colonial poetries, discussions on post-colonial poetry refuses to transcend national boundaries. And very seldom do poets of post-colonial countries get recognized for their efforts to mediate between two cultures, basically between maybe an oral culture or an oral tradition and an imported literary tradition, to reclaim indigenous identities, landscapes, traditions, etc. So he cites these two reasons to be primarily why post-colonial poetry is less visible when in comparison with other genres like drama and fiction. And then he goes on to ask another poignant question, which is why is post-colonial criticism less receptive to post-colonial poetry? And he says maybe because post-colonial studies are more into trying to interrogate itself, trying to look at questioning its own complicity in the European discourses, so it gets less time to move into analyzing or giving visibility to post-colonial poetry as such. And the second reason he cites is because post-colonial studies is basically grounded in mimetic presuppositions, and poetry with its dense form, with its opaque less transparent figures of speech or formal structure does not really fall into this particular category. And again, I would like to read from the essay what Ramazani tries to talk about, in spite of all this less visibility of post-colonial poetry in contemporary poetics. There are poets who were cited earlier at the beginning of this particular essay, who actually tried to or who have successfully tried to incorporate their names into readings by inserting national and regional nuances in concert with the post-colonial horizon. So he says, we can better appreciate how Louis Benet, for example, participates in both the West Indian performance tradition and a broader post-colonial poetics of irony. Again, let me continue reading. Similarly, A.K. Ramanujan compares artificial waterfalls in a bank in Chicago to wavering snakeskins, and thus borrows an ancient Tamil metaphor. But we miss something unless we also notice that his double vision is rooted in post-colonial condition. Okotpa Bithek was trained at Oxford as an anthropologist, specializing in East African oral literature. Yet his poetry instances a post-colonial ambivalence towards the discipline, that is anthropology itself, both appropriating ethnographic modes of representation and fiercely rejecting British anthropology's Eurocentric values and Christian bias in the 1960s. So citing examples of these poets like Benet, Ramanujan, Bithek, and what Ramazani tries to point out is that it's not simply because they are poets who think beyond Eurocentric notions, but because they have experienced post-colonialism in every sense, or because they've gone through post-colonial experiences, they've thought critically about post-colonial experiences, that they can better represent themselves in poetry across different nations. So I guess we'll just stop with the introduction today. The rest of the essay will definitely come later in short videos. Thank you.